We're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2016 Global Dialogue on Waste. We're proud to be conducting the Global Dialogue on Waste consecutively for the 4th year. And we recently crossed 2,000 followers on Twitter. Meanwhile, we provided more than 2,000 hours of waste education, thanks to more than 100 contributors from around the world. Coming to today's discussion, we have Professor Margaret Bates from Northampton University and Professor Cindy Isenhour from University of Maine. I'll let them introduce themselves, and we'll start with some questions and let the discussions evolve from there. Cindy, do you want to introduce yourself?
No, not at all. I'm Cindy Isenhour. I am an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Maine, and I specialize in economic and environmental anthropology. As it relates to this discussion, I've got an active research agenda on the reuse economy in the state of Maine, and have previously done quite a bit of work on environmental governance surrounding policies to reduce materials throughput and waste.
Right. Thank you very much. And Margaret?
Hi, I'm Professor of Sustainable Waste Management at the University of Northampton. I'm a bit of a waste obsessive, so anything remotely linked to waste and resource management. At the moment, I'm involved in various projects in the developing world, particularly in Africa, around electronic waste. I've got experience of other aspects of that as well, which I'm really interested in what lessons the developed world can learn from the developing world in things at the top of the waste hierarchy. And also I'm involved in an EU project called Rebus, which is about encouraging resource-efficient business models. So moving from our traditional ways of working to more sustainable ways of doing business.
Great. And Margaret, it looks like you're also moving up the hierarchy in CIWM.
Yeah, I will be president of the Chartered Institution of Waste Management, which is our professional body, from October.
Great. Congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So, great. So, talking about today's panel, I mean, when people in developed countries, which is less than 20% of the world's population, use resources at today's level, we've already entered a geological period called Anthropocene, which is the age during which human activity has been the dominant influence on climate and environment of our planet. And now just imagine people in developing countries like India, Latin America, Africa, and China using resources at the same level. It'll have a long-lasting impact on our planet. So it's extremely important that we focus on consumption of resources, and prevention of waste and reusing and sharing resources is one aspect where waste managers can play a significant role, and today we're here to discuss that. So, Margaret, when we talk about developed and developing countries, there's definitely something that they could learn from each other. So, do you want to talk about that?
I mean, I tend to think that developed countries like the UK, are much better, unfortunately, at the lower end of the waste hierarchy. We can do the treatment and disposal, but we see affluent, meaning we don't need to worry about waste prevention or reuse. And I think your comment about how this will impact in developing countries is really valid. A study showed that uptakes of PC and mobile phones in parts of Africa were increasing by factors of 10 to 100, and that they're likely to be producing more e-waste in developing countries than developed in the very near future. So that whole, and that's why I'd be interested to hear Cindy's comments about, more about the behaviour change, because I think the fundamental problem we have now is that we dispose of things. We can afford to buy them, so we do. People want to show that they own things. So, a mobile phone, the latest mobile phone, or the latest piece of fashion. I was talking to a friend who said that her daughter struggles now because she's expected to wear a new outfit every weekend when she goes out. To which my main response was, I'm so glad I don't have that any longer. It's bad enough at posh events to try and change what you wear, but every weekend? So people just buy cheap disposable stuff because that's the only purpose to it. I mean, it has to be very poor quality to only manage once.
Right.
So I think that behaviour change aspect is the absolute key about managing expectations.
Mm-hmm. Cindy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I certainly agree that behavior is at the root of the problem, and I guess what I would argue is that those behaviors have really deep cultural and structural roots, and I think while it's really tempting for us to say, we can ask individuals to change their behavior and that will cumulatively result in the types of changes that we need to see, I think that the most contemporary and cutting-edge literature that's now developed quite a consensus in consumer studies is that those types of approaches where we're providing education and trying to enlighten people on alternatives has not been particularly successful. And I think what we're moving toward now in the study of kind of the impact of consumption and how we really change behaviors is toward progressively toward more policy, which is tough because on the one hand, particularly here in the United States, we're not in a great policy place to be able to institute progressive environmental governance. That said, I think there's some hope in that we see a lot of continuing developed country grassroots movements and even nascent movements surrounding alternative platforms. So, Margaret, you mentioned fashion is just one example, and we all know textiles are such a huge part of this equation. It is interesting to start seeing some of these online-based thrift stores where you can rent fashion and not necessarily have to purchase it. I'm not saying that those are the answer, but certainly there are some advantages of the technological platforms that we have in the U.S. that could potentially help to change behavior. I think what's more likely to change behavior is an effort by waste management groups, environmental groups, folks interested in reduced materials throughput from all sorts of different walks of life, to think a little bit more about how to be active outside of the market realm and to engage in the civic realm to push for more policy. That's where I think we'll probably have to head. It's just a question of what types of policies we can actually make happen.
I totally agree that the policy aspect, particularly in more affluent societies, is an absolute key driver. One of the things I believe that the EU WE directive on electrical and electronic waste has failed on is that way of trying to make electrical and electronic materials more sustainable. Though I've heard of examples in other countries, other European countries, where product lifetime labelling has influenced behaviours. Because if you're there to make a purchase and you see two identical items, one of which they seem similar quality, or as you can tell to the naked eye, similar quality, but one will last twice as long, then that's a really important factor in your decision making. But it's not something we tell consumers, which is, to be honest, why many brands have such high brand loyalty, because that brand will work for longer.
Yeah, I do wonder, I agree, I think product stewardship and extended producer responsibility are really important, and I also think product durability is important. I wonder if we could possibly get two different products that were comparable in all ways except for durability that would have the same price. Because I think that oftentimes the key is the artificially cheap nature of so many of our inputs. And until we can get some sort of way to internalize some of those externalized costs, I don't know that we could produce a twice as durable product at the same artificially cheap price. I don't know. What do you guys think?
I think it would be interesting to see if we could, but I remember when I bought my latest washing machine, and I think washing machines are probably one of those where durability is really an asset, because very few people change their washing machines as a matter of fashion. But I was talking to someone, admittedly in the field, And I said, I bought my washing machine particularly because of the extended guarantee, manufacturer's guarantee on parts, and he knew exactly what make and model it was.
Yeah.
Because it stood out for having, an extended motor drive. But of course, I tend to focus by my nature on we. But one of the other things where I think the UK's actually done really well on waste prevention and reuse is on food waste. So, for example, we actually were slated in Europe recently for having some of the highest levels of food waste in Europe, whereas actually what had happened is we had the best ways of measuring food waste in Europe. And of course, this is one of the problems that we're always going to come across with the top of the waste hierarchy, the waste prevention, reuse, things not hitting the waste stream, is it's impossible to measure it.
Right.
And I think that's probably what's holding back a lot of the policy, is that you can't measure the effectiveness of the policy. We've had huge debates in the UK, and they've been replicated throughout the world when we're having austerity, when waste arisings reduce, whether that's due to activities or just to the overall economic climate. And we haven't got ways of measuring it.
Right. Here, this actually reminds me of two examples. One of them is freecycle.org. It's an online platform, and they actually do try to measure, the kind of impact. So they cumulatively add all the goods that were exchanged on the platform, and then say, we avoided so many tons of waste going to the landfill, or so many, tons of carbon dioxide equivalents going, being emitted. And I'm not sure how accurate that is, but I think that is definitely an attempt at trying to measure that. And this also reminds me of another example from Hennepin County in the U.S., where the county actually invested some time and money into a goods exchange community center, and they actually do measure how many goods were exchanged in that specific area. And I think it was something like 14,000 tons of waste was avoided from landfill, or even from going to a recycling center, by doing just that in some years. So I think there are some attempts at measuring it, but I understand it's still quite difficult to.
One of the problems is that the psychological drivers and the different activities, recycling, for example, no matter how you pitch it, and I do get regularly told off for saying this, is really about putting the right thing in the right box from the consumer point of view. But waste prevention behaviours are, you have your reuse, you have buying second hand, product durability, you have your sharing economy, and so there's many different bits. And if you actually try and map them, as a colleague Stuart Barr did some years ago, recycling is very nice, clear, straight lines. Waste prevention looks like spiders fighting on a page. It's much more complicated. And like I said, I think this holds us back from the policy. And I think we need, the policy is what needs to change the behaviours, because I totally agree with Cindy. I think sometimes we change the behaviours and then we provide the supporting information so they become more embedded. For example, in the UK, we had lots and lots of public broadcasting about wearing seatbelts, which is mandatory in the UK in both front and back seats. And we had pictures of children, people dying, being thrown through windscreen. And, it should be a good motivation for behaviour change. No. Then they made it law and said you'd be fined if you didn't. And it brought about wholesale behaviour change. And then what happened is now, if you try and get in a car, I've tried this with my friend's kids, I started the engine, I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, I got shouted at. It's not safe. Put your seatbelt on before you drive. Now, they don't care whether I get fined or not, but they know the reasoning behind it now. But the policy was what brought about the change.
Interesting.
And
So, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, actually. I want to, I don't know that I'm adding much new, but I want to just re-emphasize and provide an example. Margaret mentioned that, you know, oftentimes it's really difficult to measure these things, and I just wanted to share a quick story. You know, I was just writing a grant to fund some of my work on the reuse economy, and one of the primary arguments that I'm trying to make is that the reuse economy is so incredibly undervalued by policymakers and by most of us just generally here in developed nations. And one of the reasons why is because we have such a hard time. We can see, for example, you know, how many tons were diverted from the landfill, but that's just such a small little part of the picture in terms of overall sustainability. So my colleagues and I, there are 12 of us on this project, and we were trying to think about how we could get some real kind of life cycle analyses of all of the total picture of what's saved if we have a general idea of what the reuse economy looks like. And the problem is that you can't prove a counterfactual claim, right? So we don't, if we're selling, just for example, used toasters, and we have an idea of how many used toasters were sold in a given year, we can do some LCA analysis, but we don't have any idea how many of those toasters displaced the production of a new toaster. So it becomes, because we can't add all that up, we've had a really hard time without good data making the case to policymakers, with the exception of a few studies. The Minnesota study, Oregon's done some work, but those aren't inclusive. They don't include the peer-to-peer economy in most cases. And even if you could get some data from like FreeCycle, which is great, there's still so many kind of undocumented peer-to-peer exchanges, yard sales, garage sales. So it's tough.
It's interesting though that element about, because RAP have done some work in the UK.
That's right.
On displacement factors, but they would say their displacement factors are best estimates. But also the other problem with them is we don't actually know if that varies hugely. You know, so we don't. They're a general displacement factor. Does it depend on your socio-economic class, on your race, your religion, your country of origin? Yep. All these sorts of things that we don't really know. And it's because reuse is so underestimated. And people, I mean, in the UK, I think one of the problems is we've spent so long telling people that recycling is the best thing they can do that they don't get it.
Right.
Yep.
But we've also had I have a student who works for an electronic recycler, and one of the things she told me, I've always assumed, or rather I had this assumption about reuse rates, and they vary. There's been some studies on different geography, and there was one area in particular, assuming that people who are more affluent would have stuff that was more available for reuse, more suitable for reuse. I mean, I've literally seen people return £1,000, not dollars or euros, pounds, fridges because they've changed the colour of their kitchen, and they've sent it back for recycling, which is just ridiculous. But she found that in one area the reuse rates were particularly high, and I said, but that's not a particularly affluent area. And she said, no, but what it is that the guys who take the stuff back are very close to their community, and they see the impact that reuse has on those people. So they're very aware of the fact that they might know someone who wants a new fridge or a sofa or a sideboard or something. And so they take very care over it, because it might be helping out someone they know or a member of their community. And that appears to be the bigger driver and the bigger factor in reuse, is the understanding of the need of the end user.
Oh, Margaret, I'd love to know more about that study. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in terms of reuse is the accumulation of social capital associated with reuse. And I think one thing that we're not doing that we could maybe be doing more of, at least in terms of reuse, maybe not so much in terms of waste reduction, but the idea, and this comes back to your point, Ranjith, also about what we can learn from developing economies, is that we do have quite a body of literature on what happens in economies when market access crashes or isn't present, right? So either in developing economies or in communities that have experienced natural disasters or have had some sort of fallout from the market, is that these second-hand reuse economies become much more vibrant, and they really do improve resilience. They improve community adaptability and resilience. And so, not to be a total doomsdayer, but I do think that that's a frame, climate adaptation and resilience that we haven't really, there hasn't really been enough on that yet. And I think it's an important frame, whether it be helping out a neighbor who's in need of a couch, as you say, or, whether it's alternative ways to provision food when all the groceries are not stocked. So.
Yeah. And thank you. And so we have less than about 15 minutes for the rest of the panel. So Margaret, do you want to talk about any favorite examples of campaigns that engage people to reduce consumption? Do you have any? And maybe then we can go back to Cindy and ask about zero waste tourism in Maine.
Well, one of the things that's got widespread uptake and acceptability here is the Love Food, Hate Waste campaign. Because being an affluent society, generally, we have a lot of food waste, which has big knock-on carbon effects. And what they've found seems to work well with that. There's some core messages that go across nationally. So you can get free branding, free ideas, but then they've been also incorporating it on a local level. So cafes that take end of out-of-date food and then set up, and they do as pay as you want rather than a set price. Also, following on from the French example, we've got a lot of places now, because of this heightened awareness, where you are now donating to homeless charities or other things like that. And we've also recently been reviewing some of the labelling, or the supermarkets have. So it used to be if you bought something that was suitable for home freezing, which I have to say in food waste, I think probably freezers are the best waste prevention tool going. I use mine a lot. But instead it was said freeze on day of purchase. So someone would buy something, keep it in the fridge for a couple of days and then go, oh, I best throw it out now, I'm not going to eat it. Whereas well before its best before date. But there's all sorts of campaigns about recipes from leftovers. So you can download the app where you tell them what you've got and they will give you a recipe for it. And local chefs have got engaged. They've done lots of school competitions. So it's a really nice mix of a national campaign, but with a local impact and local individuality. So it's made quite a lot of difference there. One of the other things that's not really a campaign on, but I think it's an interesting example of sort of double reuse, is export of fully functioning second-hand electricals and electronics to developing countries, where the alternative is often of very poor quality, and some manufacturers specifically make electricals and electronics for developing countries that aren't as good as other places. So I went to a repair workshop in Alaba Market in the middle of Nigeria, in Lagos, and the guy there told me that he bought brand new, not well-known brand, flat screen TVs for his house. Admittedly, I don't think he probably needed 4, but he felt he did. And they'd all broken within 6 months. So what he'd done was replaced them with brands that he felt were more reliable, but he bought them second-hand and got them repaired. And they came through his workshop that he was now using, and they'd lasted him for a year. And so he said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm just going to use the second-hand stuff, because it's a second-hand imported is better in a lot of cases than new. And I think we could move along that way quite a lot. My friend who runs the Furniture Reuse Network for the UK always says, which would you prefer? A second-hand mini metro or no, a brand new Mini Metro, sorry, or a second-hand Aston Martin. And every time I would like a James Bond car.
All right. Great. Cindy, can you tell us a little bit about zero-waste tourism in Europe, in Maine?
Yeah, although can I insert something else first?
Sure, yeah.
Is that okay? I was just thinking, in terms of positive examples, David Alloway at the Department of Environmental Quality in Oregon, who I just think is really a great thinker on all these issues, talks a lot about, what programs can we do, what policies can we implement that are real game changers, and which ones are, they feel good, but we don't really know that they could actually change the structure of our production, consumption, waste systems. And I think in terms of the examples that I see that I think really are game changers are continued efforts to start to fight for right to repair legislation. So several states are working on, restricting the sale of certain products that can't be repaired unless there is a right to repair. And some of those proposals are even coming along with funding designed to kind of revitalize the repair sector associated with those products. And I think that's, I don't know what chance they have of passing, but I continue to see more and more of them, so I think that's really hopeful. And I continue to be a big supporter of extended producer responsibility. It seems to me that the empirical data does show that asking producers to share a portion of the costs associated with waste handling really has influenced design decisions and helped a lot of producers to eliminate packaging or redesign products so that they don't produce as much waste. So I think those are areas that we might continue to go in. In terms of interesting projects, I don't know how impactful they are, but in a place like the state of Maine, where we actually have had very, I don't know what the best word to say is, but we've had somewhat spotty access to formal markets, and we have a relatively limited retail sector compared to a lot of other affluent areas of the U.S. We have a very vibrant reuse economy, and we have quite a bit of tourism that exists around that. So through antiques and thrift shops, there's also a zero waste kind of tourism project where people can go and learn about all sorts of different projects throughout the state, and lots of efforts to try to pull together examples of best case practices, so things that people are doing that are working well so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So that's positive. I'm not sure how game-changing types of programs like that are, but I certainly think that when we can tie things like reuse or zero waste into economic development through either tourism or through job creation, that will have a much better case to make for policy rationales.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying there is really interesting about the vibrant reuse economy and how some of the thrift stores. And I think one of the interesting pieces of research I want to look at is how the perception of people change with different things. So how come it's fine to buy vintage clothes, but other aspects just become second-hand and then looked down on? Where do we get the unusual aspect? With things like product longevity, is it a value tipping point that means someone wants this to last longer? And then there's the whole aspect, let alone repair, but there's also the whole aspect of upgradability. It's I don't know what it's like there, but it's very hard to find most things other than your sort of big workhorse type equipment, dishwasher, washing machine, etc. It's very hard to get those repaired here, whereas it's so easy. My mobile phone broke when I was in Nigeria. I gave it to a guy who took it away and brought it back to me the next day for 50 pence.
Wow.
Now, exactly. And it worked fine. And actually, he was very worried, and he took all the SIM card. I gave him the whole phone. He said, "No, you don't want to give me a SIM card, and you don't want me to give." Oh yes, you're probably right. But yet to have that done in the UK, I've got all my problems with the manufacturer's aspects of it, risking warranty. Whether they've got the right spare parts, etc., etc. I mean, I think it'd be interesting to see, as 3D printers become more widespread, what impact that will have on repair and reuse.
Right. Talking about 3D printers and repair, I see that iFixit and repair workshops are generally increasing, in Europe and in the US, and we also see tool libraries coming up. I'm not sure how widespread they are or how fast they're growing, but we have we have about 5 minutes for the panel. So let's talk. Let's use this time to talk about what Cindy mentioned about game changing in waste prevention or the sharing economy. Margaret, do you want to talk about what you think is game changing?
I honestly think 3D printers may be game changing because of the aspects that you can print a part for something, whether it's 20 years old or 2 years old. Of course, this may have impacts on warranties, which is whether they be real or perceived. But again, the problem with game-changing aspects are there are so many diverse aspects to waste prevention, even just in shopping behaviours about packaging. Though it's interesting that often the perceptions are not the same as the reality. The UK recently introduced a plastic bag tax. And apart from highly entertaining things in some of the press where they were going, escape the plastic bag tax, take your own bag, as if that wasn't the whole purpose of the tax. We're expecting an 80% reduction in plastic bags. And to be honest, nobody cares. It's no big deal. People just have accepted it. Mm-hmm. But it goes back to Cindy's initial comment that actually probably most of the game-changing things involve game-changing policy.
Cindy, your thoughts on game-changing stuff and waste prevention, sharing economy?
Yeah. I agree. I think we've got. I don't know that it's the most popular thing to say, but I do think we've got to head toward policy. So the question then becomes how to provide public legitimacy to that policy. I think it's one of the biggest issues we face. And one thing that I might say is that another game changer that I'll freely admit I know very little about are some of the social virtual platforms. Granted, not all of them have turned out like we would hope, but I think that the spirit behind some of the virtual platforms for collaborative consumption have a good idea, right? And they could ostensibly, if done well, really result in reduced materials use. If it's so, for example, there have been some studies, and I'd have to look up the references here, that have done some projections for what would happen if we were using all Uber-type on-demand automobiles. And we initially think that while those could really reduce automobile ownership, but on the flip side, we've seen that people tend to go further in cars versus bus or biking, alternative transport. So some of those can backfire in unanticipated ways. But that being said, I think if they're designed from the very beginning, to ensure reduced materials use and waste, that they could be really positive. So we'll see.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me of Professor Carl Zemmering from Pratt Institute. When he was on the panel, he asked all of us a question, which was, which is the best designed car? And then I think the answers were ranging from, hybrids to electric cars, etc. But then he says the best designed car is a zip car because it can be shared by so many people when it comes to environmental impact.
Right.
Which is interesting. And so we have less than 3 minutes. Margaret, do you have any final thoughts and conclusions about the future of waste prevention in the sharing economy?
I think it's one of the things I think is particularly interesting about it really is that a lot of the lessons to be learned are from where we would the opposite way to what we'd normally expect. So some behaviours are very well established in developing countries, and we really need to learn from those in developed countries. But also the big variety amongst different, what we would consider relatively similar countries. So I had a student who came here from Italy, and she said the acceptance of second-hand in Italy is very, very small. So people aren't interested, they want everything new, and she was surprised by how many charity shops there are, because that's one of the main ways that reuse is facilitated in the UK, is through charity shops. So people tend to feel doubly good because they've supported a good cause and they're helping their impact on the environment. But I think reuse needs to have much more focus nationally, internationally and locally, because it delivers so much better impacts socially and environmentally and economically than some of the other things where we focused much more.
Cindy, final thoughts?
I actually can't think of anything else I want to say other than thank you for the invitation. It's been an enjoyable conversation, and Margaret, really nice to see you in person. I've been familiar with your work, so nice to meet you.
Thank you. It was really enjoyable. Thank you.
I'm glad I connected the two of you. I could really see how happy you were to start talking. I was not required as a moderator. But one thing I wanted to mention when we were talking about the research that we're doing and making an impact on policy, I came across an article which says that evidence-based policy making is about it influences political decisions or policy decisions by 1%. That might not be true, but that's that kind of gives us a sense of how important evidence-based policy making is. And one of the suggestions is to focus more on disseminating work. I mean, as researchers, we put a lot of time into doing the research itself, but not enough time or resources into disseminating it. So one of the suggestions was put more time in disseminating, and also focus on building networks at different levels of the society or different levels of policy frameworks. So I think with that we could probably end the discussion here.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day. Yeah.
Okay. Bye, everybody.